Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 Neal B. Freeman Lecture. Before I ask you to welcome our speaker to the stage, let me give you a bit of background on the namesake of this lecture, Neal B. Freeman. Neal Freeman is a trustee emeritus of the Fund for American Studies, having served on our board of trustees for more than a decade. In that capacity, he helped shepherd several of our journalism programs for undergraduates and professional journalists. That was a logical area of focus for Mr. Freeman, given his background in most aspects of journalism in his career, from writing to producing, and working in print and television and all other areas of the media. Neal Freeman is the founder and former chairman of the Blackwell Corporation, an advisory firm in communications, defense, and wealth management. He has produced over 1,000 television programs in his career and won awards for journalistic excellence, including a Peabody, an Emmy, and the Documentary Medal for International Film and Television. He was a longtime friend of the political commentator and author and magazine editor William F. Buckley. Neal served for a time as the Washington Bureau Chief for National Review and the founding producer of Firing Line, one of the longest public affairs programs that ran on public television in the history of public television. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, USA Today, Forbes, and many other publications. And he's also the author of several books, including Skirmishes and Walk With Me, An Invitation to Faith. Neal was nominated by President Reagan and served on the board of directors of the Communications Satellite Corporation, or ComSat, that had responsibility for all the American satellites circumnavigating the globe. He was executive producer of the public television series Technopolitics and American Interests. He also served as a director of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Thanks to Neal Freeman's generous support, we're able to hold this annual lecture to recognize effective and engaging speakers on topics of freedom, virtue, and the bedrock principles of a free society. Tonight, the Neal Freeman Lecture will be presented by Samuel Gregg, a distinguished fellow in political economy at the American Institute for Economic Research, AIER. Dr. Gregg has written and spoken extensively on questions of political economy, economic history, monetary theory, and natural law. It is fair to describe him as a prolific writer and one of the most eloquent defenders of the institutions and ideas of a free society. He's the author of 16 books, including Becoming Europe, Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization, and a forthcoming book in September of this year, The Next American Economy, Nation, State, and Markets in an Uncertain World. That book has already reached #1 status in several Amazon categories, and it's not going to be out for another 3 months. 2 of his books have been shortlisted for National Book Awards. He has had many of his books and over 400 of his articles translated into other languages. He also serves as a visiting scholar at the Heritage Foundation, affiliate scholar of the Acton Institute, where he worked for the past 21 years until this week, and a contributing editor at Law and Liberty. He has a Doctor of Philosophy in Moral Philosophy and Political Economy from Oxford. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a member of the Royal Economic Society. Tonight you'll have the opportunity to hear from one of the most thoughtful and thought-provoking thinkers on the scene today. Please take advantage of this opportunity to deeply engage with Dr. Gregg's words and the ideas that he presents, and let them inform your thinking on his important topic, America as a Commercial Republic. It's a fitting topic, especially given that this is the day after we celebrated Independence Day. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sam Gregg.
Well, thank you, Roger. I'd like to begin by thanking the Foundation for American Studies for inviting me to deliver the Neal B. Freeman Lecture this year. I've long admired TFAS's work, and I hope that my lecture this evening contributes to that enterprise. So, unless you have been living on the Galapagos Islands for the past 7 years, you will know that there has been a substantive debate about free markets in America. From the late 1980s onwards, I think it's fair to say, a relatively free market consensus developed across America to which most of the right and even parts of the left eventually adhered. More recently, however, we've seen an increase, especially among conservatives, of sympathy for industrial policy, protectionism, and interventionist policies. On the left, this has been accompanied by what's called stakeholder capitalism and advocacy in some instances of 1970s style social democracy. Now, in this context, free market supporters like myself have found our ideas subject to fierce critique, derided in some instances as market fundamentalists. Now, it's true that some defenders of markets have indeed couched their responses primarily in economic terms. Much of the debate, after all, pivots around questions of economic cause and effect and disputed facts about the American economy and society more generally. But for all its force, the economic case for free markets cannot resolve all the apprehensions that many Americans have about their country's future. Alas, when some free marketers do attempt to inject more normative dimensions into their defense of markets, some of them seem unable to move beyond frameworks which absolutize individual autonomy and see no common values beyond utility or ever-expanding rights grounded in self-expression. Now, however insufficient such answers may be to the criticisms of progressives and economic nationalists, I do regard market-skeptic diagnoses of America's economic problems and proposals for change as flawed, and deeply so. That said, those who are market skeptics today have forced those of us who regard free markets as the most optimal set of economic arrangements for America to restate the case for markets, but in ways which recognize that we are not living in the 1980s anymore. Over the past 2 decades, some of the most noteworthy changes in America have been associated with economic traumas, like the 2008 economic recession. Remaking the case for markets in America cannot disregard such realities. Nor can we ignore major developments in the geopolitical sphere. As nation-state competition intensifies across the globe, issues of national sovereignty, national cohesion, and above all, national identity have become key reference points around which international politics flows. To pretend otherwise, I think, is foolish. It's one thing to articulate compelling policy positions. Market liberals are highly skilled at that. But such arguments are not sufficient. They are especially insufficient in an age in which questions like, who are my people? Or where do I belong? Have become omnipresent in Western societies. Now, these changes mean many things, but one thing it means is that the case for free markets will lose in America if it remains narrowly economic. Instead, that case needs to be wrapped into a broader story about America. For if American defenders of markets can only offer an argument for more stuff produced more efficiently for more people, or if they trivialize the very real bonds that many Americans have to their country and their communities, millions of Americans will not listen to them, no matter how compelling the economics. So recognizing this, I think, underscores the need for free marketers to persuade Americans that markets aren't just about economic growth. They can also help express an understanding of America as a commercial republic. This is the ideal of a Republican form of political community that integrates a strong case for economic liberty into a vision of America as a free and commercially orientated sovereign nation in a world in which other sovereign nations are pursuing what they regard as their national interests. This idea of America as a commercial republic brings together understanding of the strong empirical case for free markets and limited government with a commitment to the moral habits associated with commercial society, with the conviction that these are good for Americans as a sovereign nation, and with the argument that this is ultimately faithful to the principles given powerful expression in America during the founding period. Now today, therefore, I don't propose to explain why economic nationalism is the wrong economic path for America. For those of you interested in my thoughts on that subject, there's many articles I've penned on that topic. I also address the issue in my forthcoming book, which Roger mentioned, The Next American Economy, Nation, State, and Markets in an Uncertain World, due out this coming September. Instead, I want to address the deeper normative foundations for the market economy in America. For the battle for the American economy's future goes far beyond issues of economic efficiency and growth. In our time, such questions touch especially on matters of identity. Perhaps it's because I'm an immigrant to America, but I think that what gives America its distinct identity as a nation is its rootedness in certain ideas. The historian Gordon Wood sums this up in his recent book when he stated that the principles embodied in the founding documents and debates, quote, seem to have a quality that transcends time and space. Americans look back to the 18th century revolutionaries and the constitutions and documents they wrote with a special awe and respect. No other nation, he adds, invokes its 200-year-old documents and their authors, and in quite the same way that America does. Such is their importance for interpreting the Constitution or judging the actions of contemporary politicians, legislators, and judges, that these texts and debates have become, Wood writes, our source of identity, end quote. Now, if this remains true for most Americans, and I think it does, the case for the market economy in today's America must be associated with the ideals expressed in the American founding era if the case for markets is to have legitimacy. Legitimacy. That which leads us to accept something as consistent with America's identity as a country. Now, ironically, this is well understood by those proposing radically different ideas for America's economic future today. Those associated with the 1619 Project, for example, they understand that advancing their view in America and their economic agenda, which is deeply hostile to free markets, must involve delegitimizing that founding. So for these reasons, I think that those who favor free markets need to integrate the case for markets into an understanding of America which emerged out of the founding. In the 1790s, key American founders sought to establish a republic in which the habits and institutions of free enterprise, competition, and trade would be integral to its identity. Now, it was not inevitable that things would turn out this way. Some founders had dreams of America as an agrarian paradise that would gradually grow across the limitless West and thus develop horizontally through physical space rather than vertically through means like the division of labor and intensive capital markets. Thomas Jefferson's initial preference for a confederation of mostly agrarian polities owed much to ideas going back to the Roman Republic concerning the supposedly corrupting effects of urban commerce. Now, against such outlooks were founders like Alexander Hamilton. Just as learned in Greco-Roman sources as your average Virginia gentleman planter, Hamilton had no patience with rural romanticism. For him, America's future depended upon economic modernization, a sophisticated financial center, and the pursuit of internal and foreign trade. And the aspiration underlying this outlook was summed up by George Washington, who in a 1788 letter envisaged America as, quote, a great, a respectable, and a commercial nation, end quote. So what does this mean? Well, let's shift forward to the 20th century. The number of post-war intellectuals who sought to integrate arguments for economic liberty into the American story was relatively small. One individual who had some success in this area was the theologian and philosopher Michael Novak, author of the tremendously influential 1982 book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. Novak's primarily remembered today as the first to produce a strong theological defense of free markets. Less commented upon is that Novak's book also offered a defense of the market economy rooted in a distinct idea of America. Novak argued that the moral and political structure underlying American capitalism had been articulated by founders like Washington and Hamilton and 18th century philosophers like Montesquieu and Adam Smith. They developed a vision of America as a commercial civilization. The civilization to which they referred was summed up by the social philosopher Ralph Lerner in a 1979 essay. He summed it up as a commercial republic. Now, as Lerner described it, the commercial republic envisaged by key founders was one that placed the habits crucial for a free economy at the center of its social and political life. These founders did not regard commerce as the whole of life. They also recognized that the viability of commercial societies was highly dependent upon particular practices, courtesy, promise-keeping, courage, etc., as well as certain institutions, functional families, rule of law, etc., whose roots were in turn traceable to older traditions, older customs, long-standing philosophical perspectives, and even religion. Nonetheless, such founders did seek to give economic freedom a more central place in public rhetoric, practice, and institutions than most pre-modern societies, in which birth, rather than talent, counted for everything. Now, the centrality of this ethic of commerce, Michael Novak maintained, encourages the spread of ideas and habits that have spillover effects in politics, in society, and even in international relations. Commercial societies stress practicality, therefore putting tendencies to utopianism firmly in their place. The commercial ethic also recognizes the importance of incentives and self-interest and understands that these cannot be limited to the economic realm and affect how we approach everything else. Then there are the particular virtues associated with commercial societies: prudence, industriousness, thrift, creativity, self-restraint, the willingness to trust people we have never met before. But of crucial importance for Novak was that this set of ideas was expressed in a distinctly American setting between the 1760s and 1790s, and in many cases with a direct view to shaping an emerging American political order. Nowhere was this more expressed than in that most influential set of writings, the Federalist Papers. few other sources have explained so well the Constitution's original articles and how they relate to each other. That, however, is only part of the story. The Federalist also amounts to a brief for a commercial republic that the authors thought would serve America well in economic but also non-economic ways. In envisaging the nation, the American nation, as a commercial republic, the Federalist had several things in mind. First, the American regime was to be republican. This meant that the people needed to be guided by public reason rather than fickle majority opinion. It also meant that the governed were to be regularly consulted and that public affairs would be conducted via accepted procedures that limited arbitrary power. That same republic, however, was primarily to be commercial rather than military, like the late Roman Republic. Republican government would thus be combined with a modern private enterprise economy undergirded by property rights and subject to the disciplines of commercial and competitive markets. Yet the deeper meaning of this regime went beyond according preeminence to commerce. The unleashing of enterprise, an ever-increasing division of labor, and domestic and international trade was envisaged as contributing to the ongoing refinement of commerce as a central element of modern civilized countries. Federalist 8 hints at a strong parallel between the republican virtues promoted by the Constitution and the virtues promoted by commerce. The habits which made for commercial success would thus reinforce republican virtues against those habits which threaten republican practice, habits like hubris, venality, laziness. Now, in the late 18th century, commerce remained associated in many people's minds with what was called mercantilism. That outlook is not, however, to be found in the Federalist. Domestically, Federalist 11 articulates an unabashed defense of free trade throughout the Republic. Skepticism of tariffs vis-a-vis other nations also pervades the Federalist. Though allowing them as a revenue source for the new federal government, Federalist 35 underscores tariffs' negative effects, insofar as tariffs effectively force some members of the community to subsidize others and help particular businesses establish, quote, a premature monopoly of the markets, end quote. Tariffs, the Federalist says, force industry out of its more natural channels into others in which it flows with less advantage. Tariffs are, Federalist 35 adds, quote, prejudicial to the fair trader. And by that was meant those people who did not seek favors, who did not seek privileges. Now, this sounds distinctly like Adam Smith's critique of how tariffs prop up monopolies and prioritize the interests of politically connected producers over consumers. Nor does the Federalist articulate a positive view of what we would call the regulatory state. In Federalist 62, for instance, we find a very concise summary of excessive regulation's negative effects. Quote, every new regulation concerning commerce presents a new harvest to those who watch the change, a harvest reared not by themselves, but by the work of the great body of their fellow citizens. This is a state of things in which it may be said with some truth that laws are made for the few and not the many, end quote. So the American commercial republic envisaged by the Federalist runs counter to those who would use law and regulation to privilege themselves. Instead, Federalist 11 states this republic would embody, quote, the spirit of enterprise that characterizes the commercial spirit of America, combined with a bottom-up economic dynamism and the relentless search for opportunities in domestic and foreign markets. Federalist 12 had no hesitation in describing this as essential to the life of civilized countries. Entrepreneurship, trade, and economic modernization are thus presented as crucial prerequisites for realizing non-economic goods, like the greater unity, justice, domestic tranquility, common defense, and general welfare envisaged in the preamble to the Constitution. Undergirding all this is a distinct realism about the human condition. Federalist 6 cautions against, quote, the deceitful dream of a golden age and illusions of human perfectibility. The realism of the Federalist also pervades its treatment of America's approach to the rest of the world. The Federalist presents commercial republics as innovative, restless, risk-taking, and not inclined to insularity. America's commercial dynamism couldn't help but flow over the Republic's borders into international markets. Indeed, by 1786, America had already emerged from an economic depression, and American merchants were trading extensively with other parts of the world, not just the New World in Europe, but as far abroad as Alaska, Africa, Russia, and East Asia. Indeed, Federalist 11 affirms that the American spirit of enterprise was leading Americans to trade with China and India and challenging monopolies there exercised by Britain, France, and Portugal. Now, holding the commercial and the republic parts of this American political equation together was never going to be easy. The Federalist acknowledged that the republic outlined in the Constitution presupposed the existence of people of integrity, talent, and character to lead it. Then as now, there was no guarantee that such individuals would rise to the top of politics. Much also depended upon the creation of a basic institutional infrastructure fit for a modern economy, sound public finances, a judicial system free of corruption, rules required for efficient money markets, etc. Then as now, foreign affairs played into economic policy issues. The radical ideological turn taken by France from 1789 onwards had immediate political implications for America's trading relations with the rest of the world. During Washington's presidency, Jefferson and others called for what they called, quote unquote, commercial discrimination in order to enhance Franco-American trade, primarily because of their positive view of the French Revolution and their determination to hurt Britain. Alexander Hamilton, by contrast, maintained that trade policy should be driven by national interest, not by specific factions' ideologically driven foreign policy preferences. He also pointed out economic realities, such as the fact that Britain was America's biggest trading partner and would likely remain so for some time into the future. Hamilton also stressed that international trade of the type promoted by Adam Smith did not yet exist and might, as Smith himself acknowledged, never fully emerged. Nations could not ignore such economic facts of life. So these fierce domestic debates that were occasioned by the nexus of trade and foreign policy issues, which divided Americans and split his own cabinet, weighed heavily upon America's first president. This is why it's important to recognize that much of the ideal of America as a commercial republic expressed in the Federalist comes together succinctly in George Washington's 1769 farewell address. Like all such documents, the farewell address sought to achieve several immediate goals. But Washington also sought to lay down some long-term principles upon which he thought all Americans should always reflect. And that included articulating a particular conception of America as a commercial republic, in which the word republic conveys much more than commitment to a sovereign regime of a particular type, while the word commerce provides an interpretive key as to how that republic understood itself. At the same time, Washington portrays his ambition for America in the world, that of a sovereign nation freely trading with and able to hold its own among other nations. So the view of markets articulated by Washington in the address's recommendations to Americans of his present and the future turns out to be overwhelmingly positive. Washington sought to teach Americans that the greatness of their country was inseparable from freedom of enterprise. Washington presents, quote-unquote, unrestrained trade between America's East, South, North, and West as binding the country together, as each region capitalized on its comparative advantages to meet the other's economic needs, and endowed America with, quote, greater strength, greater resource, proportionally greater security from external danger. Like the Federalist Papers, Washington's farewell address is infused with realism. Certainly, Washington said, America should, quote, observe good faith and justice towards all nations. But he said America's conduct of foreign relations could not be grounded on what he called disinterested friendship. Indeed, Washington thought America should avoid particular attachments, and commerce has a way of underscoring that point. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations, he said, is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. So while the farewell address rejects isolationism, rejects autarky, rejects imprudent international engagements, and rejects cynical realpolitik, America's national interest is firmly associated by Washington with American commerce's extension across the globe. And central to that outlook is a general commitment to free trade. As Washington elaborated, quote, our commercial policy should hold an equal and impartial hand, neither seeking nor granting exclusive favors or preferences, consulting the natural course of things, diffusing and diversifying by gentle means the streams of commerce, but forcing nothing, establishing with other nations conventional rules of intercourse, the best which present circumstances and mutual opinion will permit, but temporary and liable to be from time to time abandoned or varied as experience and circumstances shall dictate. Now, plainly, this is not a purely laissez-faire position. Trade, Washington recognized, is subject to all the ups and downs that characterize foreign affairs. The fluctuations generated by wars, economic crises, natural disasters, etc., may occasionally require some intervention. Nonetheless, the farewell address's outlook is far removed from the policy prescriptions of an 18th century mercantilist, let alone a 21st century protectionist. The proposed norm offered by Washington is that of a sovereign nation whose citizens exuberantly, competitively, and as far as possible freely trade with each other and across the world. Like the wealth of nations, Washington allows for exceptions. Still, he regarded trade openness as necessary if America was to become, to use his words, quote, a free, enlightened, and at no distant period, a great nation. Now, this conception of America as a commercial republic, articulated in the farewell address and the Federalist Papers, contrasts with Montesquieu's understanding of the same type of polity. Montesquieu maintained that what prevents commercially focused societies from disintegrating was that people's tendency to pursue their self-interest is tempered by that same self-interest. While the commercial republic envisaged in the Federalist and the farewell address take the workings of self-interest for granted, these texts are far more explicit than Montesquieu regarding how much such polities need other reference points to survive and prosper. While attaching a high premium to commercial success and displaying confidence in economic freedom's benefits, these founding documents stress the necessity of cultural and moral resources that motivate people to think directly about the well-being of their fellow citizens and the Republic as a whole. The remedy for the challenges arising from vibrant commercial orders was not, from Washington's standpoint, anything like today's administrative state. In his farewell address, he affirmed religion and morality as the indispensable supports, as he called them, of political and economic prosperity. Washington also underlined the importance of institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge and refined education for realizing that objective. Now, these recommendations reflect an Anglo-American Enlightenment temperament, a belief that a republic in which commerce played a prominent role needed formation and foundations shaped and inspired by the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, as well as a concern for natural rights and natural law that was part and parcel of late 18th century American thought. They were, Washington said, essential for what he called private and public happiness. The same, I'd suggest, is true today. 21st century American economic life, profoundly influenced as it is by the New Deal and the Great Society, is far removed from the spirit that animated the idea of America as a commercial republic. This being the case, some of you might ask, why should Americans look to particular founders or important founding documents for inspiration as we reflect on our country's economic future? Given that we are more than 200 years distant from the founding, it could be argued that too much has changed for its insights to carry much weight in today's America. 21st century America is less white, less Protestant, and less dominated by men. It is also more shaped by ideologies antithetical to the ideas concretized before, during, and after the American Revolution. In economic terms, today's American economy is neck deep in state regulation and intervention, bequeathed by American progressives, modern liberals, social democrats, and extensive conservatives. America today more resembles a European social democracy than many Americans are willing to admit. So the differences between the world of the Federalist Papers and the Farewell Address and contemporary America are real. Some of them may even be for the better, insofar as they underscore that the blessings of the American experiment have proved capable of encompassing a wide plurality of individuals and groups who occupied very different social, political, and economic statuses in the 18th century by virtue of their ethnicity, their religion, or their sex. Now, this matters because America's ability to reforge its economic direction along the lines that I've suggested depends upon much more than returning to sound economics. It is at least as much about affirming many of the ideals underpinning the American experiment. America's contemporary competition with China certainly concerns economics and national security. But the competition is also about whether America's values will prove stronger than the very different outlook that drives Chinese state capitalism. Getting America's own house in order is the sine qua non not only to dealing with a belligerent China, but also to reattaching the market economy to a distinctly American political regime. This will not occur without a renewal of faith by Americans in the American experiment at every level of society. Because in the end, it's domestic self-confidence that allows nations to behave with self-assurance at home and abroad. Unless Americans regain that self-confidence, America's capacity to shape its own economic destiny while simultaneously taming dragons abroad is going to be limited. So this, I think, underscores two important reasons for grounding the case for the market economy in these distinctly American ideals. First of all, it disassociates all the values and institutions that characterize markets from an opaque globalism, while simultaneously illustrating that those promoting a state-centric future for the American economy are out of step in important ways with the ideal of a self-confident America animated by the spirit of enterprise. Secondly, by reminding ourselves of the centrality of entrepreneurship, of competition, of trade to the American founding, we may advance advocacy for these things beyond economic arguments. Yes, the empirical dimension of contemporary economic debates matters, because the truth of such matters is vital to deciding America's economic future. But economic truth is not sufficient to settle these questions, because Americans are not simply economic beings, and America is much more than an economy. So, to conclude, is there a real possibility that an American commercial republic fitted up for 21st century challenges will emerge to shape America's future? To be honest, I don't know. The forces who want to put America in a direction that goes towards even greater state intervention are very real. More generally, while the idea of an American commercial republic repudiates state capitalism, whether from the left or the right, it also rebukes those, again, on the left and on the right, who appear to have no particular affection for America and its experiment in freedom. And alas, some Americans involved in public life today fall into one or both of these camps. But despite these obstacles, I see no reason why America cannot embrace the habits and disciplines associated with markets while also grounding them in the language, norms, and virtues of the American experiment. They are, for the most part, mutually reinforcing. Above all, the potential for a fresh economic page in America's history, a new age of the American commercial republic, presents America with the possibility of embracing a political economy characterized by hope and grounded in the confidence about the perpetual potentialities of the American way of liberty and virtue. And where there is hope, especially when grounded in something as extraordinary as the story of America, nothing, I think, is definitively lost. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. There are microphones here and here. I ask that you identify yourself and where you're from, and please limit yourself to a question, because I suspect we'll have many.
Hello, sir. My name is Eric Roram. I'm from Dallas, Texas, where I go to SMU. My question is, it was a very interesting talk, the argument that we need to couch these arguments in a sense of American identity. But in my generation, at least my sense is that there's very little nostalgia for American values or these sorts of issues. It seems like the criticisms tend to be more about inequality or social mobility or the state of welfare in our country. So is there a way to couch a defense of free markets in terms of these concerns?
Yes. So let me say a couple of things. One is, obviously those things play into any defense of markets at any one point in time. Every generation has concerns about equality. Every generation has concerns about all those things that you just mentioned. They're not new. And I hear people say, well, my generation has this unique perspective. Generally, no, that's not true. It's usually the case you go back to the previous generation when they were the same age. They said some of the same things, albeit with different emphases, but nonetheless they were still there. So definitely it's the case that those who believe in free markets need to be able to answer those types of questions. So to take the equality issue for one thing, markets, of course, do embody a type of equality, right? And that's the most important equality of all, which is before the law. That is the most single form of equality, before the law. That's why rule of law matters. That's what gives rule of law its moral strength and character. But to that, you have to ask yourself, well, why does that matter? Well, it matters because it reflects our equal dignity as human beings. It reflects the fact that there are no superhumans, there are no subhumans, there's just humans. We all have the same equal dignity before the law. Markets tend to focus upon those sorts of things. When people who are in favor of markets talk about equality, that's inevitably where they usually end up going. So it's not equality of outcomes, it's not even equality of starting points, it's equality before the law. That is not something you hear a lot of critics of markets talking about. They generally don't talk about those sorts of things. So there are certainly ways in which those who favor markets can pick up on the equality argument and say, you want to talk about equality? Let's talk about the equality that actually matters and forms a form of equality in which does not involve using state power to basically try and equalize conditions, equalize social and economic conditions, which inevitably means you have to use a lot of state power. Because it's interesting when I find younger people talking about these issues. On the one hand, they're very anxious for the government to stay out of all sorts of parts of their lives, but on the other hand, they're also anxious for the government to get involved in other parts of life as well. So there's a certain inconsistency about some of these things, and I think free marketers should be willing to point out some of those inconsistencies as well. But here's the tie back to some of the things that I was talking about in this presentation. It's very important to remember that things like equality in the way that I just described it, all human beings are created equal. In the modern era, that's only been given relatively strong recognition over the past 300 years. So before the 18th century, you had people who were understood as being qualitatively different from one another by virtue of their birth, right? Aristocrats and everyone else, right? So some fundamental differences. In the 18th century, you see a lot of challenging that, particularly in the context of the United States, and that's one of the reasons why I think you see a concern for rule of law, which is essential to the equality that I just mentioned to you, but also constitutionalism starts to become seen as very, very important. So these things are not nostalgia. These things are rooted in our history. And I think it's very difficult to understand the importance of these things unless one is willing to go back and say, where do these things come from? Why did they emerge at this particular time? What were the alternatives on offer? So that's all important, not just because I think that free marketers need to engage these subjects when they're debating these sorts of issues, but it's also a reminder that we shouldn't be taking these things for granted, which is what I sense with a lot of people, not just necessarily younger people, but also a lot of older people as well. So yes, I think touching on those issues that you just mentioned are all very, very important. And I think free marketers do have substantive answers to those questions. But I also think that historical awareness of where these things come from and why they matter is helpful because it makes you realize that there are things that we just simply shouldn't be taking for granted. And that matters, I think, especially when it comes to arguing the case for markets, whether it's against social democrats on the left or economic nationalists on the right.
I guess you already answered this in part answering his question, but I wanted to ask about your view on socialist policies integrated with our free market. I understand the argument for a completely free market in terms of competition being perfect and everything, but on the left, at least, it's seen as almost one of the main points, I guess, of the seminar was one of the main points of the seminar was that revitalizing the trust in the American dream or the American free market. But I guess just your point of view on socialist policies integrated with our free market.
Well, I have several thoughts on that subject. So when I hear people from outside the United States say things like, America has this radical capitalism where everything is deregulated and Americans live in a laissez-faire economy, that's just simply untrue. It's just simply untrue. Something like 32% of America's GDP is in some way controlled by either the federal government or state government. So in other words, almost a third of the American economy is not actually free. It's controlled directly by the state. Another thing that's also important to remember is that America is a highly regulated economy. So the federal code of regulations is over 100,000 pages and growing, right? So that's another thing I think is important to keep in mind. Another thing to look in mind is that if you look at the various indices of economic freedom that are freely available on all sorts of websites, you'll see that economic freedom in America has been in decline significantly since 2008. Significant number of Western European countries, who we often sort of deride as being social democratic and all that, they're actually freer in many cases than the United States. So we don't live in an economy that is, I don't think we live in a socialist economy, but we live in a much more regulated economy, a much more directed economy, a much more planned economy than I think certainly most foreigners understand, but even many Americans don't fully grasp. And yet there's still lots of people are still calling for more regulation, right? So we live in it's not a socialist economy, it's very much a mixed economy. Lots of regulation, lots of planning. Macroeconomic policy in this country is basically done along Keynesian lines, and John Maynard Keynes was not a big authority for free markets or anything like that. He was very skeptical of many of those sorts of things. So when it comes to this argument about socialism, I will always say, look, no, we don't live in a socialist economy, but we do live in an economy which is far from being free. And if you compare the involvement of the economy, the government, be it federal government or state government, or the administrative state, the involvement of these things in the American economy, it has only grown and grown and grown and grown. So when I hear people say they want more of this, my response is always, how much more can you possibly want? Right, so, but here's the thing, most people don't realize these things. Most people are not aware of these sorts of things. Many people think of America in the way that I just described it, as this radically laissez-faire set of arrangements. But it's just not true, and I think that free marketers need to do a better job at reminding people how far away we are, America is, from this idea of a commercial republic and this dynamic commercial sector that's part and parcel of that. What I would hate to see is a lot of Americans grow up and find themselves just accepting this situation as normal. And I think some Americans are inclined to accept it as normal, and there are even some Americans who like this type of situation. But the long-term cost for that, whether it's in terms of decreasing levels of entrepreneurship, which is happening in America, decreasing levels of competition that's happening in America, all these things are on the decline. So it's less a question, I think, about talking about socialism. It's much more a question of making people realize just how big a drag government is on our economy today, and to try and envisage what it would be like just to reduce the size of the state, even if it's only by 10%. Imagine what the American economy would be like. I guarantee it would be more dynamic, more capital intensive, and more Americans would be more prosperous for longer periods of time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for speaking, Mr. or Dr. Gregg. I'm not sure. Anyway, my name is Joshua Replogle. I am currently studying at the University of St. Andrews, and
In
well,
Scotland?
yes,
Oh, very good.
I suppose you've partially answered the question already, but especially with regards to, well, different examples being the National Health Service in the United Kingdom and NASA in the United States being large portions of state interventionism. What degree of interventionism do you think is appropriate, especially also comparing it to the Gilded Age of the United States, like from the 1870s to the early 1900s?
Right. Well, I can tell you all about the National Health Service in Britain. Britain is a national health service with a country attached to it. I mean, I'm increasingly inclined to think. I mean, it's it's an albatross around its economy. It also produces, it's one of the worst healthcare systems in the Western world as a consequence. Now, that all being said, what then should government be doing? What are the sorts of basic functions that it should be undertaking in a type of free economy? I take that to be the gist of your point. Well, I think things like national defense are things that is something the state should do. I also think that foreign policy is something that the government should do. I also think the police power is something that governments should do. I also think upholding property rights and maintaining rule of law and a judicial system that's free of corruption are all very important things that governments, really only governments, can do. And if you think of all those things I just mentioned, rule of law, property rights, efficient judicial system, national defense, etc., these are not small things. These are actually very, very, very big activities. And when I hear people say, well, that sounds like a night watchman state, I'll say, do you understand how much money has to be spent on those things? How many people have to be employed to make those things work, who have to be recruited, who have to be trained, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those asking the question, what is it that government must do, has to do in the conditions of a free economy? And to make that criteria relatively strict. So you're saying, basically, well, what if a private institution can't do it, then a government institution must do it, and then to ask yourself what those functions are and what institutions best fit those functions, that gives you a pretty good sense of what I think government can and should do. Now, would this take us back to the situation of the Gilded Age, as you described, towards the last quarter of the 20th century, going into the, up until really the Depression of the 1890s, et cetera? Well, it's important to remember at that point of history that we had very high tariffs in the United States. So government was actually pretty protectionist, which I think actually was a big drag on the American economy at the time. Certainly you had a very small army, relatively large navy, but a small army. Property rights were more or less enforced. There was a judicial system that worked pretty well. So if you think of all those sorts of things, then I think you're getting pretty close to certainly what, asking yourself what a minimal government structure might start to look like. Now, what's interesting, of course, is that at the end of the Gilded Age, you saw a significant depression, and you also saw the rise of progressivism, which is Americans going to German universities. What a great idea that was. Coming back in the early 20th century and basically saying, we don't believe the Constitution is a relevant document anymore. that whole preamble thing, the Declaration of Independence, they're time-bound pieces. We need to re-engineer America from the top down. That was the prevailing sentiment among a lot of American elites at that particular point in time. And that's where I would say that we really started to drift away. So before the New Deal, certainly way before the Great Society, we started to move away from what I would argue would be the sort of ideal settings for what government should be doing in a commercial republic. Getting back to that is going to be extremely difficult because there are so many vested interests now, particularly in this city, that will fight that tooth and nail because they are so invested in these government institutions.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is James Eiler, and I'd just like to thank you for coming to speak to us today. So I agree with regards to your points about the importance of couching free market arguments in documents which Americans think are fundamentally important. But my question is, what about the rest of the world? Because even if we optimize America, if we optimize economic growth, we optimize population growth and all of that, America is still going to be an ever smaller percentage of the global population. That's inevitable. We're still going to be a smaller and smaller percentage of the global economy as developing nations industrialize. They're always going to be growing faster than we will because we're a developed nation. And so if we want to sort of turn back the tide of authoritarianism from China and Russia, we're going to need global allies who share similar values, have similar systems that will work with us. But obviously those countries will not have the same sort of fundamental faith in founding documents that we do. As you mentioned, America is the only country that reveres its founding documents as much as it does, and other countries have founding documents that are not nearly as liberal as ours are. And so how would you propose sort of exporting and ensuring the growth of those fundamental sort of liberty-based ideas in other countries that we need on our side?
Well, thank you. That's a good question. And it's particularly important in the context of what I mentioned towards the end, which is America's geopolitical competition with China, which is a real thing and which I think, frankly, a lot of free marketers were not attentive to. They just weren't attentive to it. There was, I think, this vision that very much associated with Francis Fukuyama and his book, The End of History and the Last Man. Remember, he said sort of we're all moving in this general direction of markets. We're all moving towards liberal democracies. And it's sort of inevitable. Well, no, it turns out it's not, right? So what this means is, as you say, that making the case for markets it's part of the competition, right? And it can't be just an economic competition, it's about a competition of values. Now, you're quite right. Outside the United States is obviously not the association of free markets with American founding documents, American history, etc. That said, I would point out that some of the most important freedom movements in the 20th century drew directly upon things like the Declaration of Independence. Ho Chi Minh drew upon the American Declaration of Independence. Now, it's a bad example, but the point is, they looked at some of these things and said, this America is a sort of the shining light on the hill. And there's still plenty of people outside the United States who think about America in very similar ways. That being said, I think that every country that wants to move down this path of economic liberalization, free trade, etc., they all have a challenge of how do you ground these things in a particular culture that is affirming of these things. Now that makes it hard in some cases because some countries don't have strong, long histories of cultures of liberty. China is a good example. China's dominant political culture is one of 5,000 years of authoritarian top-down rule that's enforced pretty brutally by Beijing. For 5,000 years they've been doing this. So what I think it seems to me needs to happen in many of these countries is they need to find cultural and political reference points within their own history that point to and give legitimacy to market protocols, entrepreneurship, as well as market institutions. And frankly, that's easier in some countries rather than others. So I think in a country like Britain, there's enormous potential, right? It's so woven into their own history, but not just in terms of documents, but things like Britain's rise to become the world's greatest power was very much associated with the emergence of industrial capitalism and free trade and the abolition of the Corn Laws, etc. There are, you may not believe this, but there are actually strong free market traditions in countries like France. I think, generally speaking, Anglo-American societies have a much easier job to do in this regard because there's a much stronger tradition and attachment to economic liberty compared to other countries. But I think that any country has no choice. It has to look within its own resources, its own traditions, its own heritage to find these liberty-enhancing reference points. And even in a country like Russia or China, there are particular strains of cultural and political thought which point to these particular types of institutions and protocols. Now, these countries are not stuck in time. They're not stuck at a period whereby they're going to be doomed forever to live in a sort of quasi-social democratic set of arrangements. But I think if they're able to find sufficient reference points within their own societies and cultures, they're going to be in a much better position to persuade people that this is part of who we are. These things, these institutions, these habits, they're not something that comes from the outside. There's something that can be rooted indigenously, if you like, within our own societies. We're seeing this now. A very good example where this is happening is India. India is a very good example where the society has gradually moved much more in a pro-liberty, at least economic liberty, direction significantly over the past 20 to 30 years. And some very clever Indian political leaders and economists have made a point of associating these things, not with America, but with distinctly Indian traditions and history that go back before the period of the Raj. That, I think, is the way that you do that, and that's the way that these countries are in a position to start to establish a particular type of economic culture that will make them much more simpatico, if you like, to the type of economic culture that America has enjoyed for a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How about if I present Dr. Gregg with the official TFAS shirt? There you go. Thank you for being a great audience. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more questions of people lined up at the mics, but Dr. Gregg will be here for a little while, and so please come forward, ask your questions. Please go back now and have some great discussions tonight. Thank you.